Hi everyone, my name is Daniel Lanwa, better known as GCSE Potential, and in this video I'm going to go through absolutely everything you need for African kingdoms to achieve an A-star in African kingdoms. So I'm going to be covering the knowledge, the important knowledge, the high yield knowledge, exam technique, and then finally how to revise to achieve the A-star. I achieved an A-star in 2024, as you can hopefully see on the bottom left of my screen. This is OCR A-level history, the African kingdoms module is unit 2, but I'll touch into all of that in a minute. So let's get started. Why am I doing this video? Three main reasons. Firstly, not enough available online. When I studied African kingdoms, there's literally nothing, so I'm trying to fill a gap. Number two, more people should study it. I think it's very easy to say that I don't want to study, or like from a school's perspective, it's very easy to not study a more niche module because there's not enough information available. So hopefully by making this video, teachers would be less hesitant to study something like this. And finally, I did fairly well. I achieved 29 out of 30 in African kingdoms in the summer of 2024. As you can see in the bottom left, I achieved 20 out of 20 in the 20 marker, but only 9 out of 10 in the 10 marker, which I was very upset by, of course. This is from my script, by the way. I received my scripts back, which is why I can, provide like more informed information and like useful, actionable tips for you guys. Here are the off-page comments I received on my scripts. So for the first question, the 9 out of 10 that I achieved, they said analysis of both factors with detailed knowledge, level 6, which is like the highest band. And then for the second question, which was out of 20, which I achieved 20 out of 20, they said some interim judgments, but with much detailed knowledge, consistent focus on question level 6. So just to unpick this a little bit, level 6 is the highest band. Interim judgments are like where you basically evaluate after you provided some sort of information and analysis. What I find really weird, by the way, is they said some interim judgments, as if to imply that I could have done more. And despite that, they gave me 20 out of 20. But for the 10 marker, they basically just glazed me the entire time. They just said positive stuff, and yet they only gave me 9 out of 10. So I was very upset about that. But anyways, detailed knowledge, that's the common denominator. That's the important thing to focus on. See, if it's past 2025, you understand this. But yeah, I was very upset by the fact they gave me 9 out of 10 without giving an explanation. So examiner before, after my paper, something must have been wrong with them. Okay, sorry to whoever this is. Here's the flow of the video. I'm going to do an introduction, which I'm doing at the moment, which is like the general vibe of the module. I'm going to cover the key information, which you should know. So this is hopefully going to be useful for Year 12s and Year 13s. The second thing I'm going to do is YouTube Shorts, right? So I'm going to do a short summary of exam technique. The reason why I'm doing this now, early on, is because I want to provide you, basically, when I provide information, I'm going to do it in a way that's conducive to exam technique. You'll understand what I mean by that in a second. The third thing I'm going to do is cover the kingdom. So cover the high yield knowledge. What I mean by high yield knowledge is like the most important stuff about each kingdom. We'll also go into like quite a good level of details, essentially everything I memorized. So if you memorize anything more, it's helpful, but not necessary. I subscribe to the 80-20 rule, the kind of idea that as long as you have like 20% of the information, you should be able to cover 80% of the content with your answers. I think you can cover 100%, to be honest, with all I'm providing you with, because this is the only thing that I memorized, and it got me 29 out of 30. So I guess take this with a grain of salt. How to revise, A-star. So yeah, this is just how to revise based on evidence-based revision techniques. This is the stuff I sort of align myself with and have done for GCSE and A-level. And then finally, exam technique advice, A-star. So this is based on achieving 29 out of 30, sort of how I approach my exam questions. Cool. So African kingdoms is 15% of the OCR A-level history A-level. It's 30 marks, so some people think it's not that big of a deal. But what you mustn't forget is that 30 marks is the difference between a B and an A-star, right? So it is important to obviously try your best. I'm sure that if you're watching this video, you're probably a nerd, so it doesn't really matter that I'm saying this anyways. But yeah, 15% of the A-level, only 30 marks, 10 and 20 marker. Okay, exam technique, YouTube Shorts. So when you're approaching an essay question with African kingdoms, what you can see on the screen here is how I approach a 20 marker. So I have 3 main body paragraphs, which is sort of split up into themes based on the question. So maybe economic, political, religious, etc. You provide 3 bits of evidence and analysis within each paragraph, and you provide interim judgments, and you consider both sides of the argument. So 3 bits of evidence and analysis, I'll touch on that in a second. Interim judgments is just the idea that after you provided evidence and analysis, you relate it back to your overall point within the paragraph. And then considering both sides of the argument is just at the end of the paragraph, you use a piece of evidence to like counter the point that you've made, just to show that you're balancing it up. But then after you've countered it, you beat it up. So just to reiterate, 3 big pieces of evidence and analysis supporting your point. 1 piece going against your point, but then you beat up the piece going against your point to sort of solidify your point. That's what I did. So evidence and analysis is basically just English lit. This is the thing that I think took me from a B to an A-star in A-level history. I used to approach it like a headless chicken. I didn't really know why I was putting facts in. But then I realized essentially what you're doing is trying to use these facts to understand what society was like back then. So for example, a fact I've got here, the example I've got here, is the tomb of Askia, where Askia Muhammad II and the Songhai Empire was buried, was unique, large, and next to the river. you could basically waffle. It's not necessarily waffle because it is informed, but you're just making a point based on that fact. So the fact that it was next to the river means he probably wanted to be remembered, because if you're next to a river, then more people are going to go across the river and they're going to see you. So more people are going to remember you. That tells us a little bit about him. Furthermore, the fact that it was large and unique implies that he was very rich. You couldn't do that unless you were rich. And also probably that he was a special person, since nothing else like that really existed. And another piece of evidence to solidify this that I think is on my flashcards is the Tomb of Vasco is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, which means it's super fancy and like important. So I guess it goes to show that he achieved his goal. But the point I'm trying to make here is that evidence and analysis, what you're essentially doing is taking a fact and then seeing what you can, like what insight can be provided by that fact. That's what analysis is, okay? You have a fact, you unpick the fact, and then you use it to prove a point. So that's the whole thing with A-level history. That's the approach that I took. Obviously, I'm not gospel, but there we go. All right, next. Oh God, these transitions so bad today. I'm giving you ammo. For the love of God, aim straight. What I'm trying to say by this is, throughout this video, I'm going to try and give you as much knowledge as possible, as much important, useful, precise, and detailed knowledge as possible. Your goal is to use the knowledge that I provide you with, as well as the exam technique that I provide you with, to aim straight, to put it into practice and actually achieve the marks. I'm yapping a little bit, but there we go. Pulp Fiction reference you have to get today. So here are the 4 kingdoms, well, technically 5. Songhai is the first kingdom, Kongo is the second kingdom, Oyo and Dahomey is like a comparative study, so there's 2 kingdoms in one, and then, well, they are 2 kingdoms, but like in one sort of study. And then finally Benin, and as you can see, Benin is distinct from the rest of the AI-generated images. Sorry about that, there's literally no images online, it's so difficult. But Benin is very distinct in that they have Benin bronzes, which are very interesting cultural artifacts, but we'll get onto that. Here's an introduction to West African history. So as you can see, West Africa, hopefully you can see my cursor. It's naturally on the west side of Africa. I think this image, it's very difficult to find images which have all the empires, but Songhai is obviously there. Mali is there, Ghana is there. Mali and Ghana aren't formally within African kingdoms, but they are like subsidiaries of different empires. So Songhai was formerly the Mali Empire, etc. So here are the 4 points I'm going to cover in the first bit of this chapter, I guess, Introduction to West African History. It's the first bit of the ebook. So kill your biases, colonialism, historical sources, and cultural achievements. So firstly, kill your biases. Basically, us Westerners, right, us people who've grown up in Britain, we have very absurd views of Africa, which have been perpetuated and propagated by different media sources. This was just a research paper I found. There's a ton of stereotypes of Africa, so danger, darkness, violence, poverty, and hopelessness. Many Westerners view Africa as primarily a jungle or a desert landscape where people speak unintelligible languages, and these have really obscured our views of Africa. And as a result, it's important for us to let go of these biases so we can actually unpick information without any sort of preconceived notions, so that we can actually access this information in a proper way, so that we can really appreciate, I guess, the cultural advancements and the amazing things about African kingdoms. So basically, let go of your biases, be open-minded, we're young, we're impressionable, go for it. Yeah, and just to like sort of illustrate my point, when Britain first entered Benin, they actually claimed that what was going on in Benin, so like the Benin bronzes and stuff, they couldn't have been made by Africans. They just refused to believe it, which goes to show, I guess, the immense strength and I guess beauty as well of the things that African people were able to achieve, especially within the Benin Empire. The second point, colonialism. So a thing that most people think is, as soon as colonizers came, like Spain, Europe, well, anywhere in Europe, Portugal, etc., came into African countries, they immediately just ceased to this colonialism, and that was it. They'd completely taken over. When in actuality, that's absolutely not the case. As we're going to see with the Benin Empire, the Benin Empire was very good at holding off colonialism. They did so for, I think, 200, maybe 300 years. It wasn't like a sort of domination relationship, although it did end up being the case for some empires. It was more so like maybe transaction, they had some sort of developing relationship, and then it went badly. It's a lot more nuanced than initially is thought. So that's just the point I'm trying to make with that. Third thing, historical sources. Okay, I can't lie, I'm sorry, this is AI generated once again. I was very much at a lack of information. The point that I'm trying to make here is a lot of these sources in African kingdoms are oral sources, or like untraditional sources. So oral sources just means like people speaking, sort of information coming down via mythology and stuff like that. That's why some of the stuff may come across a little bit absurd at times. I don't know if absurd is the right way to put it. It's more like mythological, like or spiritual. So for example, I think 7 years, 7 months, and 7 days. Stuff like that is maybe done in a specific way to help people remember, or just because by nature of the way that information is being passed down. I'm sort of speaking in tongues at the moment, but hopefully what I'm saying makes sense. Oral sources means we just have to appreciate the way that these sources were passed down and what that means for us. Finally, cultural achievements. As I sort of mentioned earlier, there were some amazing cultural achievements which took place in Western Africa, and they're things which we certainly need to investigate and look at with a lot of intrigue, because a lot of cool stuff happened. Timbuktu, for example, Songhai Empire, was amazing, and a lot of modern day was directly derived from Timbuktu and what revelations were unfounded there. So yeah, those are the 4 points I wanted to make. Cool. Songhai Empire. Let's begin with the first empire. That is Muhammad Askiatur on the left. There's a lot of video games, I think, which revolve around empires. And thankfully, Muhammad Chor came up in one of the video games. So there we go. This is from a video game. So let's begin. The Songhai Empire is obviously on Western Africa. As you can see, there are 4 main cities which have been highlighted: Djenne, Gao, Timbuktu, and Takasa. So Djenne was, I guess, quite an interesting place that we'll touch on in a minute, but there was a lot of warfare which took place there. So that's like the reason why it's important. Timbuktu was obviously the cultural hub. A lot of questions that you get, like 20 markers, about like advancements which took place in Timbuktu, etc. So it's quite an important one to think about and research. Gao was kind of the center of Songhai. There was a lot. It was sort of the location where trade took place. So that's something that's important to note. And there's also a saying by Al-Bakri, is some scholar in 1068. He said only a Muslim could rule Gao. So Songhai was very much revolving around Islam. And then finally, there's Takasa, which is the northernmost part of the empire. And that's where the salt mine was. And the salt mine eventually led to the downfall of Songhai Empire, arguably. And we'll touch on that towards the end. So here are the 7 points we're going to go through. And this is going to be a very similar, consistent theme throughout these empires. We're going to touch on the rise, firstly, of the empire, the military, the economy, the political, religious, cultural factors to do with the empire, and then finally the fall of Songhai. The reason why I've done it in this way, as I mentioned earlier, is so it's conducive to exam technique. When you do 20 markers and even 10 markers, you want to split them up into themes, like military, economic, political. So I'm trying to make your life as easy as possible. This is exactly what I did, and it saved me. So hopefully it will save you too. Songhai Empire, let's begin. The rise of Songhai, here are the 3 points. So the first point is the leadership of Sonny Ali. As you can see there, just a random image. Sonny Ali was the initial leader when it came to the Songhai Empire. He stole a property in Egypt. Once again, 2025 joke. Sorry if you didn't understand it. The whole point of Sonny Ali, the reason why he was so amazing, questionable phrase, is because he sort of leveraged the downfall of the Mali Empire. So as you can see on the third slide here, fall of Mali, 1464. He leveraged that, since it was a very rich empire, to take as much land and loot and like wealth as possible. So were it not for him leveraging the fall of Mali and other factors like the geography of the Songhai Empire, then they arguably wouldn't have been as successful as they were. So that's why, and he was also very just good at like military stuff. So for example, in 1464, he took over Timbuktu. In 1468, I think he took over Djenne, and in 1472, he took over Gao. So those pieces of evidence sort of indicate that he's quite a good leader. Second point is the geography. So the Songhai Empire itself was quite close to the Niger River and had the Niger River running through it. And that was naturally quite advantageous when it comes to trade, because it means that people can come from foreign lands into the country. It makes it easier for trade to take place, into the empire, sorry. It makes it easier for trade to take place, and therefore it will be kind of a hub for trade. And there's also the Trans-Saharan network, which Songhai was involved in. So Trans-Sahara just means across the Saharan desert. There's a lot of trade taking place there between tons of different countries. And that gave rise to Songhai itself, because it provided it with sort of the facilities to grow as an empire by providing it with wealth, mercantilism, all of that stuff. The final point is the fall of Mali in 1464. Scholars debate when this actually was, but the whole point here is Mansu Musa. He's a very rich bloke. He was arguably the richest bloke ever. And when the empire fell, there's a lot of money and land to be grabbed. And that was useful for the rise of Songhai, because were it not for the fall of Mali, they wouldn't have been able to, I guess, gather that loot and land, which gave rise to the Songhai Empire. So those are the first 3 points. Leadership of Sonny Ali, geography, and fall of Mali in 1464. Nice, military. Here are the 3 points: light armor, naval power, and success in battle. First point, light armor. Can't lie, this photo, I've nabbed it at some random website, but light armor, there we go. Don't know why you're looking at his face, you should be looking at his armor. But yeah, the first reason why the Songhai military was really good is because they had light armor. This was very important because they were in Africa in a very hot climate, since it was near to the equator. That gave them comparative advantage in battle, okay? And because of that comparative advantage, they were able to have a lot of success in battle, okay? So Songhai Empire, one big thing about the military, light armor. Second thing, naval power. In 1472, Songhai smoked Djenne, okay? Smoked them. And they had 400 wooden boats which they used to smoke Djenne. What I mean by smoked is basically took out the people who were already there and took over the land. So It took them 7 years, 7 days, and 7 months, so a lot of time. But because of that naval power, they were able to do so. Those wooden boats allowed them to sort of, I think the word is siege the area, which means they sort of encapsulated them, cut off all access to food, water, etc., which is very dodgy in like modern day standards. But there we go. That's what they did back then. Third point, success in battle. So I guess the piece of evidence here is just in Agadez, which is part of Nigeria, in 1501 and 1515, the Songhai Empire was able to steal the land, basically, take over the region. They were able to do so twice. I guess it doesn't necessarily reflect them in the best state, because the fact that they were able to lose it after 1501 is slightly questionable. But then again, the fact that they were able to get it back means it was a good thing. So you can take that in either direction. Shows them as weak or shows them as strong, depending on how you view it. Cool, economic. So the economy of the Songhai Empire. Firstly, expanded to Tarkaza. The fact that it was so far north that it expanded all the way to Tarkaza is very, very impressive. And it sort of goes to show the huge stretch of the empire's economic capabilities. So basically it just had a large impact on the economy of Africa. It's a very large economy, which is very important. The other point that was made is that they traded gold with Marrakesh. Because Tarkaza is very, very far north, they were able to have access to like North African countries such as Morocco. So Marrakesh is obviously within Morocco. So the fact that it was such a large empire meant that they were able to trade with a lot of different partners. The second point, and this is so interesting, okay, Islamic law, Sharia law. Sharia law was implemented within Songhai. So it was a key facet of the Songhai Empire. And as a result, the reason why Songhai was so successful, arguably, was because they implemented Sharia law. Because all the traders were sort of expected that you were Muslim. Because all the traders were expected to be Muslim, they implemented Islamic rulings within the economic system. And that was so good for the traders because it provided them with a sense of security and safety. So Qadis is the first point. Qadis are Islamic judges in this case. And what it meant was, whenever there was this dispute, because all the traders subscribed to Islam, whatever the Qadis said, they basically would just agree with, because the Qadis were following the rulings of Islam. And as a result, trade was far more stable, which was very advantageous, right? Imagine being in areas which are just full of instability and whatnot, but suddenly a new region comes about which is completely stable, right? It's very, very unique to have. And just as a point, this was implemented during the Askir rule, which we'll touch on later. The second point, the weighing system. Under Sharia law, I think it was under Sharia law, or for whatever reason, they developed a weighing system which was just unique to the region. They weighed different goods. So for example, gold maybe, they weighed them in a new way which was standardized, and standardization is really important because it means that you have more like safety and security with your trade because you know exactly how much it is. If everything's a different currency and stuff, it makes it far more difficult. Not necessarily a different currency, but just a different way of measuring weight. The third thing, basically Morleys for traders. I don't even know what I meant by that. I guess the point is just that everyone goes there because it was so like safe and secure. Morleys for traders, I guess so, yeah, because all of us go to Morleys. There we go, that's the point that I was making. But yeah, the general thought here is that because of Islamic law, the economy of Songhai developed far faster and it was far more attractive to most traders, which led it to being a real hub of economic trade. As well as that, Gao was like the main place where trade took place. It was the main location where trade took place within the empire, and that was sort of further east, so there's more access to different areas of Africa. The final point is the trans-Saharan trade. So Berbers were like traders. They came with fat caravans, and caravans in the, I guess, historic context were just like huge groups of vehicles, so like camels, coming with a lot of things to sell. They came to the Songhai Empire from the Trans-Saharan trade because they were not afraid of stealing because of the Islamic legislation which was in place. Everyone was a Muslim, and Muslims obviously taught not to steal, and as a result, they were not afraid of him. They came all the way from North Africa, East Africa, more so documented North Africa. There's some thoughts on East Africa I remember reading about, but nothing too substantial. But those are the 3 points. Really big empire, expanded all the way to Tarkasa. Islamic law meant that it was more safe and secure. And finally, the trans-Saharan trade was quite important in allowing the empire to connect with so many different regions. Nice. Here are the 3 points for political. Firstly, name change. So after, basically, the main leader initially was Sonny Ali. He's the guy who leveraged everything and really started things off. After he died, it was Sonny Chur, who was his kid. He didn't really do much. He died pretty soon. I don't even know if his name was Sonny Chur. See, he's so irrelevant. He was Sonny something, yeah. Hopefully you can Google that. But yeah, he died right after because he was a bit irrelevant. And supposedly some argue that the Askers took over from him, which is a little bit controversial. Took over from him, meaning they sort of established a coup. They were a bit afraid of Sonny Ali, so they couldn't do that because he was known as being very brutal. He arguably molded up fetuses, which is very, very grim. And he had a bad relationship with the Muslims as well. But Sonny Chur, he was a bit weaker, so Askias took him out, supposedly, some may say. And I think the big thing to note here, firstly, with political, is there was a name change within the empire. So previously, where the leaders of the empire were called Sonny, they were now changed to Askia. That was sort of the name of the new leaders. So Askia Muhammad was the first one, Askia Daoud, it just went on. And I think the name change is quite important politically because it indicates sort of a change in direction. Imagine that the government changed the name from parliament to, I don't know, republic or dictatorship. That's going to be a bit mad. It's probably not as mad because Sonny and Askia are more just like cultural names. But the point I'm making is that it was quite significant because it indicated a shift in direction. So that's the first point. The second point, legitimacy of Askia. Start as you mean to go on. So I think I put the Illuminati there. I don't know why I did half this stuff, but I think with the Illuminati, what I was trying to say is Askia started arguably through a coup to take out Sonny Chur, or whatever his name is. So Sonny Ali's kid. And as a result, it didn't necessarily set them up in good standing, because if you had started via coup, then it probably indicates that there's going to be instability later on. Conversely, after Muhammad Askia, it was actually quite light. Like, there weren't that many succession crises. There were about 2 main ones. So it seemed okay for the most part. But yeah, that's, I guess, the thing. Start as you mean to go on. Did they start as they meant to go on? Not necessarily, because they did start with a coup, arguably. And as a result, it might have caused instability within the empire. So you could argue that it did. And it led to the succession crises in the 1530s/40s and 1586-88. Finally, political structures. Suna and Kanfiri. So these were 2 political structures within the Songhai Empire. The Suna was like an imperial council of military leaders, and the Kanfiri was sort of the backup to the main leader of the Songhai Empire. So these political structures, you should probably Google them independently to sort of understand what they were. But the general idea is they were kind of viceroys. They just supported the Songhai administration, the administration of the empire. So those are the 3 political points. Not too much to say with Songhai politically, but yeah, there we go. Religion, firstly, al-Bakri. He was around in 1068, so obviously this photo is not accurate, or I don't even know that, it's probably a sketch. But in 1068, he importantly said only a Muslim could rule Gao. That's very important because it sort of sets the foundation for what the Songhai Empire was. There were a lot of people, Sonny Ali claimed to be Muslim, just so he would be able to rule Gao, because otherwise it would cause a lot of chaos. And as a result, there was a lot of disputes and conflict between the Songhai Empire and a lot of the Muslims within the empire, like scholars and people in Timbuktu. There's a lot of conflict there. So yeah, that's the first point about religion. It was an Islamic empire from the foundations. But the extent to which the administrators believed in Islam varied. So Sonny Ali didn't so much, but Muhammad Askia did to a great extent. The second point, the tomb of Askia, and I guess this illustrates the extent to which Muhammad Askia believed in Islam. But it has a prayer space, and it was built with materials from Makkah after he went on Hajj. These 2 points are very important because it illustrates the extent to which Muhammad Askia believed in Islam, and therefore the extent to which religion was sort of within the empire. Hopefully that makes sense. The extent to which the empire revolved around religion and Islam. Third point, Timbuktu is goated. Okay, Timbuktu is goated. It's an amazing city, and it's so interesting. You should research it in your own time. But the point here is that scholars came from all corners. There are scholars coming from Morocco, Saudi Arabia, all of Arabia. There are scholars coming even from Europe. I think there's a Portuguese scholar. I don't remember if this was where I read this. But yeah, the general point is that scholars came from all over just to see Timbuktu, even if they came from a very far land. And that indicates that Timbuktu was obviously very, very knowledgeable and very advanced with their study of Islam, which therefore reflects the importance of Islam within the empire and sort of how the empire revolved around religion. The fact that scholars came from so far just to study religion within Timbuktu. So those were the 3 points for religion. Cultural. Okay, so the 3 points: education, architecture, scriptures. So education, we have Songhai Madrasa. So this was a madrasa is like an Islamic school. And this was, Islamic and arguably secular as well. It depends on the madrasa. But the Songhai Madrasa was introduced during the Songhai rule, which indicates their, commitment to education. And this was introduced during the Askia time. Second point, architecture. So Jingareba Mosque, this was also kind of religious, but it was built initially in 1327. But in the 1540s, it was revived under Dawood, which sort of indicates A, the commitment to religious principles. So once again, culture and religion entwined quite a lot. And B, cultural advancements. They were now interested in architecture and really developing the culture of the region by advancing different like local spaces that people had access to. Arguably, you could call them third spaces, where as well as practicing religion, people went to go and socialize. So that's the second point. And then the final point is scriptures. So in 1565, Dawood introduced an imperial library, and obviously that advanced culture by providing people with access to lots of information beyond just what was available in Timbuktu. So those are 3 points for cultural. Fall of Songhai. So here we go. We reached the final bit for Songhai now. We're almost done. The first point, overweening Askias. So overweening just means they're trying to have too much of an influence. And the general idea is that as the empire went by, so after Sonny Ali and Sonny Cho, I forgot his name. I think Sonny Beru. It's Sonny Beru. Oh my God. I'm so sorry. Sonny Beru. So after Sonny Beru, rest in peace, the Askias came along. And the Askias, initially they were fine, but later on, they were trying to have a bit too much power. They're a bit greedy. So in the 1530s to the 1540s, there was a bit of conflict within the Askia family. So there's a succession crisis, presumably between brothers. And then the same sort of thing happened in 1586 to 88. Because of these succession crises, it became a very unstable region. And obviously when there's instability, it's very vulnerable to attack. So that's the first reason why there was a fall of the Songhai Empire. Askias wanted too much power, that created instability, and that made them vulnerable to attack. The second point is heterogeneous. Heterogeneous, I hope it's pronounced like that. The general idea of heterogeneous is just like a very wide range of people, so a diverse range of people. The issue with diversity in the Songhai Empire was the Timbuktu area was very Muslim, but there were some regions, and most of the Songhai administration were Muslim, but there were some regions where there was traditional religion still being practiced. So traditional African religious practices, and they sort of conflicted in some of their beliefs, and as a result, different groups of people started to dislike each other. The ebook didn't go into that much detail, so there's not really too much to say except for the fact that it was just conflict within the region because of differing beliefs. Finally, the catalyst, the thing that brought the empire down, 1591 Battle of Tondibi. So here's a story time, okay, because it's quite a key event. 1591 Battle of Tondibi, an interpretation by Daniel Anwar, the one and only, okay? This is going to be absolutely horrific, but here we go. Battle of Tondibi. So it took place, or sort of, it revolved around the Tarkaza salt mines. So as I mentioned earlier, Tarkaza was the very northernmost part of the Songhai Empire. And it was near to Morocco as well, okay? Fairly near to Morocco. And the salt mine, obviously salt was very expensive back in the day. As you can see, there's camels, which indicates how expensive the salt was. Because if you're using camels to sort of transport salt around, that implies that it was a very lucrative thing. And that a lot of people wanted it, okay? There was high demand. So Tarkaza salt mine, there's beef over this because the Songhai people owned it. But other countries saw that there was instability in the region, right? Songhai had a tax on the Tarkaza salt mine, which means that if you wanted salt, or if you were mining salt there, you could mine it, sure, but you had to pay a tax to the Songhai Empire. All of a sudden, right, Moulay Ahmed, the ruler of Morocco, he said, I'm not paying tax. No, why would I pay tax? Okay, he does not want to pay tax. Tax avoidance, tax evasion, all of that. Imagine he knew about the Cayman Islands, right? So he was very unhappy at this, right? Because he was looking at the empire thinking, it's absolute garbage. I didn't pay tax to them. They're in a shambles. Askir Ishak II, who was the Askir at the time, he said, yo, my name is Johnny G. I come from Smethwick, Birmingham. You want to go? Come from the Songhai Empire. He was very upset at this. He said, no, absolutely not. You're not going to undermine my strength. I'm not having any of this. And he did something quite amazing. I still find this so interesting that he did this. And kind of hilarious, but Askir Ishak II sent over 2 iron shoes and a spear to Moulay Ahmed via messenger. I feel bad for the messenger. He probably got no-scoped, right? But the reason why this is so significant is the 2 iron shoes indicated that he's not moving. He's standing and holding his ground, right? And the spear meant that if Moulay Ahmed and the Moroccans tried to beat him, he would shank him. He would stab him, okay? He had the spear. He was ready for warfare. So this was basically the turning point, the Volta, so to speak. Moulay Ahmed is right. Lol, you're cooked. Right, the Moroccans were more advanced at this time. They had more resources. They were more well-equipped. They were richer at the time, arguably. So, why Morocco won? Evidently, Morocco won because Songhai Empire is no longer here. Rest up. 3 main reasons why Morocco won. Firstly, there was a 6-to-1 ratio of Moroccan to Songhai troops. Okay, for every 1 Songhai person, there was 6 Moroccans. Right, you're already outnumbered. You're cooked. Second point. Muskets and long-range weapons were provided to the Moroccans due to European trade. Morocco was further north, right? And if you're further north in Africa, there's easier access there's easier facilitation of access to trade with Europe. As a result, because Europe had a few more like advanced weapons, they were able to trade them with Morocco. So Morocco basically had comparative advantage. Muskets and long-range weapons meant that they could sit back on the mountains and just spam like trigger, whereas the Songhai people, since they didn't really have weapons like that, they had to sort of charge in, which is just like obviously a bloodbath. And then finally, Songhai was split by the succession crisis, 1586 to 88, and also the 1530s and 40s. If you're split like that, it's very difficult to lead an army. And evidently, that was the collapse of the Songhai Empire. Towards the end, actually, this is the final point, Askir Ishak II said he would pay 100,000 myth quals to end the conflict, which was like a currency at the time. And that's a lot of money. I don't know how much that is, but it's probably a lot of money, right? And Mullah Ahmad said, no chance. You're cooked, mate, you're cooked. And that was it. They sat cross-legged, the Songhai soldiers, they sat cross-legged waiting for death. Sort of as like a cultural thing. They're like, you know what, charge it. Game is game. Hate is going to hate, play is going to play. And that was it. Mulai, the leader of Morocco, he turned Songhai into, I don't know if he was the leader of Morocco or the leader of like the army within Morocco. One of the two, Google it, probably the leader of Morocco. But he turned Songhai into a puppet state. A pashalik of Timbuktu or something like that. But then eventually he just left it to die because it wasn't that profitable. He was trying to extract some money, but it didn't end up working because Morocco was quite far away, so it's a bit of a drag. Imagine you just won a ton of money or a ton of land, but it's in Burnley. No one's going to Burnley. Okay. So that's the end. Subscribe. This is a good opportunity to say subscribe if this is helping you. Okay, very much subscribe. And like the video and all of that. Spread it to, send it to your friends, all that. Okay, anyways, the final point for the Songhai Empire is comparing leaders, right? I don't think this really comes up with the other empires, but because there were two really distinct leaders in Songhai, it's quite important to know how to compare them just in case the 20 marker comes up. So the main thing with Sonny Ali was that the first thing was obviously he led to the rise. He was the rise of the Songhai Empire. So he leveraged the fall of the Malayan Empire to create the Songhai Empire. So were it not for him doing so, Songhai wouldn't exist. So that's a big point why he was a really good leader. Second point, he had a lot of wartime success. So he took over Timbuktu, he took over Djenne, he took over Gao. Those three big regions were taken over by him because he was a very brutal but effective wartime leader. And as a result, he was quite successful. And the final point is the initial succession. So from Sonny Ali, when he sort of passed away, from him to Sonny Baru, not Sonny Chua, Sonny Baru, it was calm, it was light. There wasn't really much conflict. So as a result, he actually took a ton of land and set up a good initial standing for the empire. Askir Muhammad, on the other hand, controversial. He was an Islamic diplomatic statesman with a modernization focus. So obviously, economically, he did madnesses, he did wonderful things, right? The integration of Islam within the economy was hugely successful. It made them a lot of money. So that's one thing. As well as that, the political advancements within the Askir reign were very evident. There was the introduction of the Kanfiri, which was a viceroy, the Sunna, which was like an imperial council of military leaders. So political strengths. And as well as that, there was a lot of cultural advancements under the Askir Muhammad. So obviously, the establishment of his tomb was quite an important cultural advancement because there was this prayer space. It was very well designed. It probably brought a lot of respect to the region because it was obviously very fancy and it was next to the river. We are speculating a little bit, but we can use that fact to analyze. So yeah, Askir Muhammad was more of like a modernization focus. Sonny Ali was more of an initial startup. Obviously, the issue with Askir was that within the Askir reign, there was a lot of conflict. Whereas the issue with Sonny was that he was a bit of a madman. And he also hated the Muslims, kind of. There was a story that goes that he didn't even know Surah Fatiha, which if you're a Muslim, you know that's kind of cooked. It's kind of cooked. Yeah, there we go. That's compared the leaders. Nice. Congo, second empire. Let's do it. Okay, let's take a breath. Nice. I'm doing this all in one take, so I apologize if I'm yapping a bit and hopefully nothing goes wrong. So Congo was sort of defined by its interactions with Portugal. Yeah, that's a big thing. That's how you should remember Congo. And remembering Songhai is kind of like, they were just a cool first one. Everyone loves Songhai, right? All of us love Songhai. So let's begin. 2 reasons for the rise of Congo. First, the power structure is the Kanda system. So within Congo, there was a system which was sort of matrilineal. That's how it worked. So you live with like your uncle, and your position within society was matrilineal, which meant that it was determined by your mum's sort of lineage. You abided by your mum's lineage, not your dad's lineage, because the men were doing madnesses, whereas the mums had to like sort of stay at home and not do much. So yeah, because of the power structures in Congo, strength was kind of built by relationships. So I think the anecdote that goes that there was one region which was forest and one region that was sort of river, and they worked together to coexist. because the forest region needed certain, I don't know, oceanic materials, and the river region needed some sort of forest materials. And as a result, they kind of married people from across the river. So if someone in the forest had a kid and they'd grown up, they would send them across to the river to go and get married. And as a result, they built these relationships. So the Kangda system was really, really important for relationships and for kind of the foundations of the power structures in Congo. So that was one reason why they rose, because of these relationships through the Kangda system. The second reason was geography and trade. I've kind of lumped them together because they kind of were the same thing. But the first point is there was a Congo River, which was obviously running through Congo. And that was very useful because it was important for the transportation of different materials and different things that you want to sell. It was a lot easier for trade to take place. So trade was very lucrative and prosperous within Congo. The second thing was Mbanza Congo, which was sort of like the capital of Congo. It was amazing. It was a very, very interesting space. You should Google it and see a photo. It was kind of like mountainous, the capital. And it was very interesting how it was shaped. So it was mountainous. There was a lot of natural protection. It was a very nice region in terms of like the location. So different countries could come to Mbanza Congo for trade. So we'll touch on a little bit later, but basically the capital was in a good location and also was in a strategic location, and its features were strategic, i.e. because it was sort of built like a mountain, there were a lot of natural defenses, which meant it was more difficult to penetrate or sort of have an attack there, which meant that I guess traders were more inclined to trade there because they're not as afraid of things going wrong. Military, you know what? I'm so good at yapping. I'm not even good at yapping, I just yap too much, so I apologize. 1665, Battle of Mbwila. That was one of the final battles in Congo, so I'm sorry, we're jumping a little bit here. But within this battle, Congo had 360 musketeers. And obviously, as I mentioned earlier, Songhai didn't really have long-range weapons. So to have 360 musketeers is quite an advanced thing. So the military was very advanced in Congo. The second thing was defensive palisades. So I think 3 defensive palisades were established within Congo. So defensive palisades means sort of just like defensive fortresses, and they protected the city, which meant it was very, very difficult to penetrate. Mbanza Congo itself obviously was mountainous, which meant it was difficult to penetrate, and then as well as that, these palisades meant that they're sort of hubs for the soldiers to stand and shoot people or whatever if they ever tried to invade. The third and final thing, which meant the military was good, was the structures. They had very developed and intricate military structures, which provided a lot of strength to their military and armed forces. One of the cool things that they did was they had a cavalry to flank the enemy, and they went on horses, presumably horses which they kind of received from Arabia. And as a result, since they could use the cavalry to flank enemies, they were quite successful in warfare and battle. So those were the first 3 points for military. Economic, first point, Malabo Pool. Okay, so Malabo Pool, as you can see there, it's kind of sick. It's kind of sick. It was the northernmost part of the kingdom, and that's where they had a trade fair. The Malabo Pool Trade Fair. It's where copper was traded and slaves were also traded. The reason why it's important is, once again, it goes to show how large the empire was, especially in terms of like its economic involvements. Malabo Pool, they had their own trade fair, and it was very, very far away, which meant they had obviously influence over a very large region, which is quite important because if you have a large target demographic for your economy, then you can be very successful within economic development. So there's lots of people that you can trade with if you have a large economy. Second point, slavery, okay? So, the big S, inevitably was going to come up. In the Congo Empire, they had relations with the Portuguese, and the Portuguese sort of seduced them into trade. Well, there's different ways that you can explain it. You can say seduce, you can say they engaged in this relationship consensually, whatever you want to say. But slavery took place within Congo. People were quite unhappy with the slavery because what was happening was newborns, so people who had just been born, were traded into slavery from birth. And obviously the people who lived in Congo were very upset by that. So in 1568, you had the Jaga invasions, which were people from the Kongo River Valley, which were just like native Congolese. They got up and they said, I'm not having any of this. And they sort of fought against the leaders of Congo at the time. And it was a really big thing because they took over Mbanza Congo. They caused a lot of chaos and havoc. And in the end, I think by 1570, the Sao Tome traders, Sao Tome, I don't know how to pronounce the name, they were sort of the Portuguese who were trading. They had to intervene. So the Portuguese had to protect the Congolese leaders, and they were the ones who ended up reclaiming Mbanza Congo and sort of bringing stability into the region. This is important, very important, because it goes to show that slavery was a big part of the economic system within Congo, but also that the economy started to rely a bit too much on Portugal. Because with the Sao Tome traders sort of saving them, you basically had a get out of jail free card, right? I saved your ass, right? You owe me one, okay? So that's the second point. Final point was Alfonso I versus João. So Alfonso was the leader of Congo at the time, and João was the leader of Portugal, pretty sure. And there was beef between them because in 1526 he sent a letter saying, hold on, you're enslaving too many people here. This isn't very nice. This isn't very nice of you. And the Portuguese were like, well, you can't do anything about it. And once again, I guess that just goes to show the reliance of Portugal, the reliance of Congo on Portugal within sort of their economic success. Their economic success was directly linked to Portugal because they were exploiting so many of their people. So those are the 3 points: Malibu, slavery, Alfonso I versus João. Just as a point to make, the study of Congo is mostly sort of looking at Europe and interactions with Portugal. So there's going to be a lot of that within this empire. Core political. 3 different points. Firstly, the Mwisi Congo. Okay, Mwisi Congo. Mwisi Congo. I miss the study of African kingdoms because I'm no longer doing that. So bad. But anyways, the Mwisi Congo were sort of the leaders of Congo, and it was an electoral system within an aristocracy. What that means is there were officials they're like 13, I think, officials who were sort of leading the charge in Congo. So those were like the main people who were in charge. But then they got to vote within that group for who's the Mani Congo. And the Mani Congo was like the big guy in charge, right? So there was an electoral system, but only the fancy people got to vote. So yeah, that's sort of one element of the political system within Congo. The next thing was the Kanda system. As we touched on earlier, it led to the rise of the Congo Empire. The issue with it, though, is religion goofed it up. So when the Portuguese came into Congo, they were Catholic, so they sort of spread Catholicism. The issue is polygamy is banned in Catholicism, and yet Congo, the Kanda system basically relied upon polygamy. So that caused a lot of chaos, right? Because you can't subscribe to something and not practice it, arguably. But there we go. People started, they may have converted initially to Catholicism. Some may have resisted. Some may have converted only in name. But yeah, the Kanda system was really threatened, and religion sort of goofed up the Kanda system, which caused a bit of chaos because now you had the people who trusted the Kanda system who were really upset, and then the leaders of Congo were like, no, it's not that deep. And foreshadowing, they didn't like each other anymore, okay? Because the Kanda system was messed up. Finally, royal structures. So, sorry, I should really take a break tonight. But anyways, there were royal structures in Congo, like Mbanza Congo had a lot of royal structures. And what these structures were for was for flexing and protection. So flexing on one part, they built like a lot of fancy structures, like in Mbanza Congo. So for example, a royal palace. And flexing, naturally, if they brought people from other countries, like even from Portugal, and they saw these royal palaces, you would think, wow, these people are kind of rich. So obviously it looked good for you, makes you look stronger, etc. Protection also, though, because they used these royal structures to scare off other people. Because if you're that rich that you have these royal palaces, right? If we try to fight you, we're probably going to lose. So we're not going to want to fight you, okay? So that was sort of the dual ambition with the royal structures. Religion, 4 points here. Wow. First time we have a 4. This is a Big Mac Whopper. Big Mac Whopper. So religion was a very important aspect of the Congolese Empire, especially after the Portuguese came in. So the first point is in 1482, Diogo Cao, who's sort of like a traveler from Portugal, he arrived in Congo. And after arrival, he was like, okay, you know what, this has a lot of potential. GCSE potential. Way. He sent ambassadors to Portugal from Congo. And ambassadors from from Congo to Portugal. So basically, they developed some initial relationship by sending people across to the different countries. And yeah, that just developed the initial relationship. To further develop the relationship, they baptized the king of Congo, and he started spreading the word of Catholicism within Congo. So that sort of initiated it. So he came in, sent a few ambassadors, developed some relations, and then baptized the king. And then finally, syncretism. This was the big thing. Syncretism is the idea of like sort of synchronizing, so sort of assimilating, kind of combining. Hopefully those words are creating a picture in your head. There was already traditional Congolese practices, but Catholicism was a new thing. So what they basically attempted to do to encourage people to convert was to find similarities between traditional Congolese religion and Catholicism and use them to sort of blag it for them to convert, right? Wow, we both believe that the cross symbol is quite important. Fucking hell, it must be the same thing. Bosh. There we go. Sorry, I shouldn't really swear this for kids, but anyways. No, it's not. You guys are 16, 17, 18. So I'll minimize swearing. But anyways, that was the first point. Second point, Alfonso I. Okay, so he was the king of Congo at the time. So the Mani Congo. He won a battle between 1506 and 1509. He was basically fighting like his cousin or something like that for who would rule Congo. And he ended up winning. Because he ended up winning, he was sort of, well, prior to ending up winning, he espoused that he was a firm believer in Catholicism. And as a result, he received support from the Portuguese, which is arguably why he won. So he had an unfair advantage, if you ask me, but there we go. He won, and in doing so, he made Catholicism like the proper state religion. So around 20 years after Diego first arrived, Alfonso really established Catholicism within Congo. And the second thing was rosaries. He used to arguably, according to some sources, walk around with like roses, which were in some way linked to Catholicism, which sort of can be used as a fact to say that he really found Catholicism to be something important to him and something that was vital to the kingdom and his running of it. The third point, resistance. Nzinga retreated. So yeah, that's retreated. That's spelled completely incorrectly. But essentially what happened is towards the end of the rule, so in the 1550s, 60s, there was a bit of beef because the King of Congo was like, well, the new King of Congo was like, I'm not having any of this because I'm not happy with this. There's too many people who are telling me certain beliefs and they're sort of forcing things upon me which I don't necessarily believe in. In 1568, polygamy was banned. Okay, the Portuguese came in and they said, I'm banning polygamy. But no one cared because they wanted to uphold the Kanda system, right? And this is why the Kings of Congo were a bit like, what on earth is going on? There's a bit of instability here. And then they tried to ban it again. I don't know what that even means. Like, how can you ban something again when it's already banned? But in 1596, they tried to ban it again. And obviously, it didn't really work. I've done a double pump there to indicate that they tried for the double pump. Obviously, they missed the headshots both times. And as a result, womp, it didn't really work. And then finally, Jesuits. Okay, Jesuits were kind of like missionaries. They came to Congo in 1603 and they were basically like, this did not work. In 1603, they said the Congolese were only Catholics by name. So essentially, they'd failed in their missionary mission. So there we go. Those are 4 points about religion. Catholicism, they tried to make it work by syncretism and stuff, but it didn't really end up working. Kind of flopped. Womp. Cool. Cultural, 3 points to be made here. Okay. So firstly, wealthy. Garcia II wore fancy international clothes. Okay, he bought a lot of fancy stuff from different countries and traded, and he wore them to make him look cool. So he had very flashy garments and stuff. That goes to show like fashion was important, I guess, within culture. You can blag that however much you want to. Next point, cloth. Cloth was really important in Congolese culture. Kind of nice. They loved cloth weaving, a lot of the people there. And they had very intricate designs, which they could sell or they could use for different practices, which was kind of cool. Yeah, pretty cool. Third thing, syncretism, right? I put a photo of Haribo Star Mix. Do you know why I put this? Certain people, they'll be doing the most madnesses. A lot of Muslims will be doing madnesses. I didn't judge. But a lot of people will be doing madnesses, like they'll be eating pork. No, they wouldn't touch pork. They'll be doing a lot of madnesses, like smoking, do weed, whatever. But they would never touch a Haribo Star Mix. And the point that I'm trying to illustrate with that is they sort of pick and choose their religion, and that's what's happening with Congo as well, right? It's going to get too deep if I dig too much into that, but that was a harmless, light joke. So let's keep going. So to begin with, the European influence within Congo is primarily Portuguese, but also Dutch. We're going to begin with the right-hand side because that's sort of a preface to the rest of it. But diplomacy. Diplomacy was incredibly important with the relationship between Congo and Portugal. So high-ranking members of the Mwisi Congo, so those were the people who were in charge in Congo, high-ranking members were sent to live in Portugal, so basically establish good relationships. So that was one effort that was made. And vice versa, some really fancy people from Portugal came over to Congo to live there. The places where the Portuguese resided in Congo, obviously you had to make them really nice. So they were 5 to 7 meters high and 1 meter thick, like a wall was established, which was 5 to 7 meters high and 1 meter thick. And that was around the quarter where Portuguese resided in Congo to sort of protect them. So yeah, they had diplomacy taking place between Congo and Portugal to establish good relationships. However, obviously, there was beef. What else would lead to the end of the Congo Empire? So there were 3 Luso-Congolese wars. Luso just means Portuguese, roughly. 3 wars, and primarily the wars were between the Congolese as well as the Dutch, because they enlisted the help of the Dutch, and they were against the Portuguese, because the Portuguese were being too avaricious. Too much slavery, too much control over Congo. They weren't happy with it. So in the first one, Congo won a small battle in 1622. But obviously, you might lose the battle and win the war, vice versa. They won a small battle. They got a bit of help from the Dutch, but then they ended up losing the big war. So they're a bit hurt, but you know what? They won again. They tried the best. The second and third wars, they really tried their best. So the first war was 1622 to 1624. And the other ones were in like the 1640s, roughly. In the second war, Garcia II wanted help from the Vatican. So they tried to enlist, the King of Kongo at the time tried to enlist a lot of help from different countries, and even the Dutch. But unfortunately, they lost again. And the second one wasn't that bad, but the third one, they really ripped them to shreds. Okay, Portugal was like, I've had enough. It's like if you had a neighbor who's annoying you, right? First time, you might be a bit annoyed, but you just charge it. Second time, they're starting to pipe up a little bit. The third time, fool me one time, shame when you fool me 3 times, you're just pissed off and you want to kill them. So there we go. Yeah, that's the third thing. My explanation is getting really bad, as you can tell. I'm slightly going insane as time passes, but alas, there we are. 1665, Battle of Mbuila. This was basically the end of the Third Luso-Congolese War. This was the icing on the cake. 360 musketeers were enlisted by the Congolese. They really went all out. But in the end, 98 titular heads were killed, which means like the main people in charge. Not like a step below, I guess, the Musi Congo. 98 of them were killed. Portugal massacred them. There was no really coming back from that. They were completely destroyed. So yeah, 1665 was sort of the downfall of the Congo Empire, or rather the start of the downfall of the Congo Empire. Yeah, that's good for now. Cool. Fall of Congo. So 2 main reasons. Firstly, naturally, 1665 Battle of Mbuila. Portugal completely cooked Congo. No coming back from that. Imagine the entire MP's cabinet, all of our MPs just got nuked. We'd be cooked. Yeah, there we go. So that's the first point. And then the second, and obviously instability was caused by this war, etc. It was just a whole load of chaos. Second point, lineage versus state. So after 1665, when the Congolese kingdom, or what remained of it, was trying to get back on its feet, there was a huge conflict between the lineage and the state. So the lineage was like the fancy people in charge, so the Musi Congo, etc. The state was like the fancy people in charge, like the Musi Congo, etc. And the lineage were people who lived in villages or whatever and subscribed to the whole idea of the Kanda system, so the power system of Kanda. They were obviously very upset at what had happened. They sort of felt hard done by. And as a result, there was a lot of conflict between those two regions, those two people who believed in different things, those two groups of people, holy moly. Mbanza Congo was sacked in 1668 and 1678. What that means is basically the capital of Congo was just completely ripped to shreds by the 2 different regions who were fighting against each other, the 2 different groups. So yeah, after the Battle of Mbuila, there was a ton of infighting, basically a civil war, which wasn't very nice. But both of those 2 things led to the fall of the Congo Empire, and alas, that was it. Okay, so we can keep going here. Here's the Oyo Empire, which is the 3rd empire. I guess just to summarize Congo, Portugal were just pricks, basically. That was it. They just did a lot of slavery in Congo, and they were a bit annoyed, so yeah, there we go. Oyo Empire. So Oyo and Dahomey, you study sort of entwined. So Oyo is the big brother, and Dahomey is the little brother. And you sort of study them as comparative studies. So like, you just study them alongside each other, the relationship they had, etc. So we'll begin with Oyo. I split them up personally, just so you have a deeper understanding, I guess. 3 reasons for the rise of Oyo. Firstly, the leadership of Oranmiyan. Oranmiyan was the first Oyo of the Oyo Empire. He sort of had some divine prophecy, and his ancestors told him, go and found Oyo, go and do something else. So he went and founded him. There we go, he just led rise to the kingdom. So yeah, that's how the Oyo Empire was sort of created. He was a royal prince, I think, or something like that. The main thing for him is he was quite good at leading people. So in particular, he synthesized the strengths of different people. The Yoruba people was the main one. There's a large longevity of the Yoruba people, so they'd been there for a long period of time. So to be able to sort of give rise to them, to sort of bring the Yoruba people and other groups of people together, was a very key and important thing that he did to give real rise to the Oyo Empire. Because if you had different groups of people who were working well together, then that's quite important, right? As we saw earlier, it led to the fact that it didn't work led to the downfall of the Songhai Empire. So Oranmiyan was able to do this successfully. So that was the first reason why Oyo grew. Second reason, geography. Okay, geography is always a big thing. So coastal, that's the first thing. Oyo was a coastal region, which meant that there was access to boats and ships, so they could do trade with different countries far more easily. So that's the first point. The second point is thick forests. Okay, thick forests. So essentially, thick forests were surrounding Oyo, and they provided a kind of natural defense for the Oyo region, which meant it was more difficult to penetrate. Because the forests were so thick, those who lived in Oyo were sort of familiar with it. They were more confident in like fighting in these areas, whereas other people weren't. So it provided them with a real advantage. The third thing was flatland. There's a lot of flatland as well as the thick forests surrounding Oyo, and because there was flatland, it was ideal for the cavalry to be used. So you had your huge horses and whatever, and you're riding the horses on the flatland. They could go super fast, so they could do quite amazing things in terms of defending their region, like immediately whenever there's a threat. And then finally, horses, as I mentioned earlier, horses were used because the flatland was very flat and it was sort of ideal for the cavalry. A lot of horses were taken from Arabia and different areas of Africa. They were sort of just brought into Oyo as protection. Yeah. Third thing was cavalry. Cavalry was super important in Oyo. The cavalry was also very advanced. There's probably a lot of stuff that I missed out, but here are like the key points. They had archers, so like straight out of Clash of Clans. You just had people just boop, and bows and arrows were used. Alari, so Alari were like soldiers. There was a royal Alari as well, but they were just soldiers. They had the whole point that I'm trying to make here is it was a very intricate system with so many different roles and different people, and that's why the cavalry was so strong. 70 Esso war chiefs, so they were sort of leading the charge. There's 70 people who were like really leading the charge, and they're very important. And they organized the efforts of the soldiers in a very meticulous and intricate way, which meant that they were very like able to overwhelm their opponents completely. And then the final point is 2 to 3 spears. Oko and Essen were like different types of spears, but the cavalry had 2 to 3 spears on them, every single person, which obviously provided them with a big advantage. Even if their spears were ever blunt, they could just back out another one. Unlimited supply. Well, not unlimited, but there we go. Okay, cool. Military. The next point. So the structure of the military, as I mentioned earlier, is very, very intricate. So another factor or another point about its intricacy is there was a guy called the Ara Ona Kanfo. I apologize if my pronunciation is bad. And he was sort of the strategic leader, as well as the Oko, the SO war chiefs. He was a strategic leader in battle. So with him, he was taking the charge. He was doing absolutely everything. He was doing madnesses, and he was making sure that Oyo won every battle. To this day, I think there's actually a bloke who does represent that, as you can see in the photo. I think there's a modern day equivalent of the bloke still within like the Oyo region, which is kind of cool. Yeah. Second point, cavalry, as I mentioned earlier, they just had a ton of people. They're like super strong cavalry. Yeah, not much else to say. Just very intricate structure. Third point, European advisors. So the Oyo Empire hired from British and Portuguese traders. They hired European advisors who would help them within battle, which provided them with a huge advantage because, as we know, Europeans were massive colonizers, so they had a lot of experience in battle. Woo-hoo! There we go. Economic, 3 points. Firstly, manufacturing area. So Oyo was very much a manufacturing kingdom. They had 500 to 600 acres of indigo, which they cultivated for dyes in Oyo Ill. Oyo Ill being like sort of the oil, the old Oyo, so sort of the capital region. So they cultivated a ton of acres of indigo, and then they sold them off as dyes. So yeah, the big manufacturing focus. Elephants was the next thing. So elephants were kind of the people in charge, similar to the military chiefs, but these are more like administrative people in charge. So the elephants were like the top of the top. Elephants and Oyos, I sort of use the words interchangeably, but they probably mean different things. But what I mean by that is the main top people in charge. They hired people to collect local taxes. So they went around to different villages within Oyo and they collected taxes from them. And what some people, anecdotally, which is kind of funny, did is impersonated the wives of the Oyo, because he had so many wives that he couldn't even tell. So they impersonated wives to try and escape their duties in collection of taxes and whatever. It's kind of funny. And the final point for the economy was that it was very sophisticated. They engaged in craft production. They had cowries, which were used as currency, and they did cowrie gouging. Yeah, those 3 points are just, I guess there's not too much to say about the economy of Oyo, but yeah, it was just kind of advanced. They used taxes, which was pretty cool. Yeah. Cool, political. So this is, I guess, one of the most important things about Oyo. They had a very interesting political structure. So the Oyo Messi were like a group of people who surrounded the Oyo, or the elephant, whatever you want to call them. And they were in charge of shrines and the military. So by in charge of the military is more like a ceremonial role. So they weren't actually doing like strategic operations and stuff, but they just were the people who were telling other people what to do. So one of the aspects of the Oyo Messi is if they were ever annoyed at the guy in charge, the elephant, they could take a parrot eggs and give it to whoever it was. So they could take, I think it was take a parrot egg and put it like on the floor somewhere. And that would basically indicate that whoever was in charge had to commit suicide, which was kind of mad, but there we go. In 1754, Gaha, who was the Bassarin, staged a coup using the parrot eggs. So obviously that was room for manipulation of the system, which was kind of problematic, but there we go. Political, what else was that? Eunuchs. So eunuchs were kind of like soldiers for the political leaders. So they were like, yeah, kind of there to protect them. There were eunuchs of the left, eunuchs of the middle, and eunuchs of the right. That was just like their fancy names. So the eunuchs of the left engaged in taxes, so they were the ones who collected taxes. The eunuchs of the middle were the ones who imposed law, and the eunuchs of the right were the ones involved in religion and upholding like traditional religious practices. The unique feature of the eunuchs was that they were castrated, which means your parts were chopped off, kind of, I think. But yeah, as a result, they did that to basically mean you could have no family. So you had to commit yourself to the political leaders. The final thing was tributes. Tributes were quite important. basically, if you were weak or inferior, or just wanted to show your appreciation or something, tributes had to be given to different people as like a sign of respect, worship, etc. So a singba was one sort of tribute which had to be given, and that was grass, troops, and cowries. That had to be given through from different villages to Oyo every year. And then Dahomey, who Oyo basically took over a few times, they had to give their own unique tribute, which was cowries, slaves, and gunpowder. So yeah, I guess those are just the two tributes, and I guess you could use them to talk about various different things. Essentially how they were able to dominate other regions by forcing them to give certain things which made them weaker. Because if they gave away gunpowder, then Dahomey would never have sort of the facilities to fight against Oyo, which is kind of interesting. Nice, religion. So 2 main points here, cults and restrictions. So firstly with cults. There are a lot of cults in the Oyo Empire. So for example, the Egungun was a cult for deceased ancestors, and the Ifa was a cult of divination. Both were, they still exist in the 21st century. Sorry, I completely forgot to change those images. I don't know if that's Diogo Cal. But yeah, those two cults existed. You can use them as evidence for whatever you want. You can sort of yap about them if you want. But yeah, it just goes to show that there was an existence of cults. And it was sort of used to centralize ideas and beliefs. Because cults existed and a lot of people subscribed to them, you could control what people were thinking. So it's quite powerful. The second point was restrictions. So the Alafin, he was sort of seen as a leader, not just to be listened to, but also to be worshipped. So he wore a crown with a beaded fringe. Don't really know what that means. Maybe Google it or something, but it's just important. He wore a specific type of crown, and he only appeared in public at 3 festivals throughout the year. And that was done in order to make it so clear that he was such a unique and special individual that you can't do anything to him. They wanted to create like a godlike idea of this guy, which was quite important. He appeared in public at only 3 festivals. And I think I remember reading that when like normal people did accidentally see him in public, they had to like sit down and like sit on their buttocks, basically. They just had to show their inferiority. It's kind of mad, but there we go. Europeans, so 2 points here. Firstly, the wealth of the ruling elite was highly dependent on slavery. So there was a bit of slavery in Oyo, not as much as Congo, I'm not really too sure. But the general point here is that the people who were in charge, their wealth was directly correlated by how much they engaged in slavery and slave relations. So that was one point to be made. Second point was location. It was a coastal location, which meant there was easy access to European trade. So Oyo did trade quite a bit with the Europeans. I think in particular, probably the Portuguese. Okay, so the 2 reasons for the fall of the Oyo Empire. Firstly, the rise of the Hausa states. So in 1804, the Sokoto Caliphate were founded, which was a group essentially trying to implement Sharia law, so Islamic law, within different regions. So they were trying to create the Hausa states, which are, I guess, not necessarily an empire in and of itself, but just different regions where Islamic law was implemented. In 1823, the Ilorin was taken by the Sokoto Caliphate, and in 1835, Old Oyo was also taken by the Sokoto Caliphate. And as a result, the Hausa states rose. Oyo was defeated, essentially. So that was kind of like the key reason for their downfall. As well as that, there's also internal discord. So just to provide a picture, you have the Alafin, who's at the very top. Then you have the Prime Minister, who is basically the leader of the Oyo Messi, who is the Bassarin. And then beneath that, you have the Oyo Messi itself. So the Oyo Messi is just a group of different fancy people. The Bassarin is the leader of that group. And then at the very top, you have the Alafin. So in 1754, the Bassarin Gaha was basically a dictator for 20 years. So he sort of established a coup based on the Parateg system of suicide. And in those 20 years, he had complete control, which created some sort of internal discord. Because obviously, how is he going to be in charge when there's also a Alafin who's probably upset at that? And then in the 1780s, Abodian was appointed, not appointed, he himself was the Bassarin, but he appointed loyalists, which was problematic because other people weren't really given opportunities to rise in their role, and they were obviously upset at that fact. So yeah, there's a lot of internal discord within Oyo. Both those factors led to the fall of the Oyo Empire. So there we go, that's Oyo done. Moving on to Dahomey, just to summarize Oyo. It's really unremarkable. I don't really like Oyo, I can't lie. You can probably tell from the fact that I wasn't that enthusiastic throughout that part. But I guess to summarize, they're kind of like just the big boys in charge when it comes to Oyo and Dahomey. They just sort of exist. I remember them mostly for Indigo. But anyways, 7 points for Dahomey. So let's get on with it. Dahomey, yeah. Where Dahomey's at. Oh my god, that's so loud. But anyways, leadership of Gaja, geography and trade. 3 factors which led to the rise of Dahomey. So Gaja was the, I don't even know how to pronounce his name, but he was the leader in 1708. So he was sort of the guy who led rise to the Dahomey Empire, or the Kingdom of Dahomey. He took Alada in 1724 and Wida in 1727, both of which were very strong regions in and of themselves. He completely took them. So a lot of similarities between him and Sonny Ali, some would argue. So obviously he was important in the rise of Dahomey because he took those two major regions and made them his own, so he could engage in trade there. He could establish his, I guess, authority. So you could argue that he was the most important reason for the rise of Dahomey. Second point, geography. Geography is always important. So mahi swamplands and forests surrounded Dahomey. And obviously if it's swampy, it's very difficult to navigate through. So those who knew how to navigate through had a really, really big advantage. And essentially made it far harder for the defenses to be penetrated at Dahomey. So that gave it a lot of strength. As well as that, it was a coastal region. Dahomey was coastal. I don't know if it's... Here we go. Yeah, you can see it's all there. Dahomey was a coastal region, but it was also quite inland. Like the majority of its operations took place further away from the coast, which meant that they could still engage in trade, but also if someone wanted to penetrate, it'd take a lot longer, and I guess it'd be a bit more evident. Like you could see them from further away, which is advantageous. The final point is there were savanna grasslands within Dahomey, which I guess was good for cultivating land, but as well as that, it was nice to use horses and cavalry there. I think they used quite a bit of horses, which I guess is mentioned here for the third point. Trade. So Dahomey engaged in a lot of slave trading. So that was the first thing that made them quite, which helped them rise, because obviously with the slave trade, you can make a lot of money. And then as well as that, they monopolized horses at one point. Yeah, that's pretty much it. 3 reasons for the rise of Dahomey. Next, military. So 3 points to be made here. First, Agbajigbeto. Agbajigbeto was a spy network, and essentially they engaged in sort of spiritual activities. Their main aim was to find the roots of enemy power and disrupt them. So they were soldiers in and of themselves, but they were also kind of spiritual in that sense. One of the things they did was bury charms in the regions where the others sort of operated. So, for example, if they're about to fight, I don't know, Wida, they'd go and bury charms there. And they would hopefully use those to create discord. That was the aim. If you bury certain charms there, then it would make people go a bit crazy. So it was like a spiritual belief. So that was one aspect of the military. The next were Dahomey Amazons. I think there was a movie about this back in the day, but basically there were women, female soldiers, warriors, who were trained in hand-to-hand combat. So it was a really, really strong task force. And I think this is really interesting from just a personal perspective, because it seemed to me initially that women within African kingdoms didn't really have that big of a role. But then when it came to studying Dahomey, and you'll see a little bit more later on as well, and studying Oyo and learning about the wives, etc., they actually had a really big influence, which was kind of interesting. But yeah, these were female warriors. And then finally, trained to disrespect. This was hella interesting. But yeah, the Dahomeyan military was trained from a very young age. It was kind of like a cultural thing that you had to know how to fight. And then as well as that, they were ruthless, man. They were ruthless. So one thing is that Wida, they worshipped snakes in some sort of capacity. So before the battle, they went and take, all the soldiers took snakes. They just munched them in front of the Wida people. And how are you meant to react to that? I don't know. Imagine someone comes and eats your god. Because that's kind of what happened. It's a madness, isn't it? It's a madness. But yeah, game is game, I guess. 3 points for the economy of Dahomey. Firstly, markets. They had a very interesting economy. You know what? Dahomey is kind of cool. They had markets in different towns every day, which was specialized. So, for example, one market might be curries. Another market might be furniture, stuff like that. So, yeah, there are different towns which held markets each day. And so there was a lot of trade there. As well as that, Dahomey, which was one of the main areas of Dahomey, they had a market every single day. So comparatively, where some markets took place in a town every week and were specialized, instead here we had them every day in one region. So markets were a big part of the trade of Dahomey. The second point was government investment. Dahomey had a very centralized state. They had high quality roads and bridges, and there was a bloke called the Migan, who was administrating foreign markets. But essentially the point is that the government spent a lot of public money, so money that they had collected through taxes, etc., to upskill the region and sort of make it better, which is kind of interesting. It's kind of modern as well. I didn't expect that. Very much like how a modern state operates, but yeah. Final point, Kaplenga. He was a bit of a controversial bloke who led in 1774. He tried to monopolize trade and fix prices at one point, and then he banned foreign trade. So yeah, he was kind of like a Trump type figure, I guess. That's how it seems to be, because some of the policies he's doing are madness, but there we go. Cool, political, Dahomey. So the first thing is absolute power. The king of Dahomey was very ruthless. So only him and the Europeans, because obviously he had to bow down to the Europeans, they were the only ones who were permitted to build houses which were bigger than 1 story, which sort of reflects the fact that they really wanted to symbolically show how powerful they were. So that's a really interesting fact which you can analyze. The second point, so the Dahomeyan king had thousands of wives. I think that, yeah, here we go, over 2,000 each. So he had over 2,000 wives. So they were kind of like political tools, I guess. Daklo was the head wife, and she was basically like, she had a lot of power. The Daklo, the head wife, was the intermission between the king himself and the rest of the wives and like a lot of different people in the community. So she was kind of like a secretary of sorts. But yeah, over 2,000 wives. It was more political because they had different roles. Like some might, I don't know, collect tax. Some might take care of the kids, etc. So wives were quite important. That was part of the political structure. And it's really interesting and memorable as well. And then finally, Tegbesu. He was a bloke. He was held hostage in Oyo in 1730s. And from that, he learned about the political structure of Oyo. And one of the things he did was copy the idea of royal Ilari slaves. So these were people who were castrated, I think I talked about earlier, and sort of had to bow down to Oyo and provide complete and utter protection. So yeah, stole that idea. Cool, religious/cultural. There's a lot of religious/cultural points to be made about Dahomey. Firstly, Vodon. Vodon was like a spiritual belief. They separated men and women in their spiritual beliefs, so segregated. And they had local congregations of different beliefs. And yeah, it's kind of just like spiritual belief in the ancestors, etc. It brought people together, but also allowed you to manipulate people's ideas because obviously you are centralizing what they believe in. In particular, the government centralized their, I guess, religious belief in Vodon through Vodon chapter houses. So basically the land upon which the chapter houses were built, or the houses for the Vodon like spiritual belief was built, was completely owned by the government, and they could like charge taxes or whatever they wanted on it. So they sort of had a monopoly over. So if they ever wanted to shut down the religion or manipulate the religion in any sort of way, they could do it very easily because they had a lot of control. Second point, Agaja. He was the bloke who led initially. He constructed a temple in Abomi in early 1700s, and he encouraged a lot of new cults, which is kind of interesting. I thought a lot about this actually. I think the reason why he wanted a lot of cults is because if people believed in a lot of different things, then it would basically like satisfy them so they wouldn't try and go against the king. Because if you believed in a ton of different spiritual and cultural beliefs, there's a lot of opportunity to sort of engage with your beliefs and go hippie and all of that. And as a result, you wouldn't want to target the kings and like you wouldn't be as pissed off, I guess, spiritual state. I know I'm prophesizing here. I'm just coming up with my own ideas, but you can come up with yours too. Yeah, it's kind of cool. Finally, Tegbesu. The Tohoso cult, he used the Tohoso cult to influence worship of Vodun spirits. So he used the cult to influence sort of how the Vodun religion took place. So the whole point is here is like the leaders in charge. So Tegbesu, the people that I mentioned earlier, they were leaders who were in charge of Dahomey, and they influenced the worship within Vodun. So because they were able to centralize it, they could control what people believed in, essentially. Called European. Alada, Hueda, and war with the Dutch. So Alada, that was a place that they sort of took over later on. They joined the trading with Europeans in the 1580s, which was cloth and ivory primarily. In the 1660s, Hueda took over from Alada, and Alada sent embassies in the 1680s to try and save themselves from, I guess, completely falling out of favor with Europeans, but they failed. So that was kind of like a backstory to Alada and why it's important to know that Dahomey took over from Alada later on. So it's kind of like a failed empire, but they took over and took all their resources, which is good for them. And obviously 1660s Hueda took over. That means it was also a good idea to take over Hueda in 1727, whenever it was. Second point, Hueda. In the 1660s, Hueda took over from, I think, Dahomey, or from other regions as like leading in charge with trade. In 1704, there was a 6-clause convention with Europe for Dahomey to become a neutral port for European trade, which is quite good for them. And then final point, there was war with the Dutch between 1724 and 1737. I don't know why, but no clue, but there we go. It just came up in the ebook, so war with the Dutch. Fall of Dahomey, 2 points. They engaged in a lot of slavery, firstly. So when there was the death of the slave trade, when Britain signed the 1807 Abolition Act, Dahomey was like, okay, we're cooked. Ehengabuda, who was like one of the kings in charge of Dahomey, tried saving slavery in the 1800s through Brazil, like working with Brazil to get them to get involved in slavery, but he ultimately failed, as we could tell, because Dahomey no longer really exists. And the second point was the dominance of Oyo. Because Dahomey had to give Oyo tributes for absolutely years, they became a weaker brother. Nobody really took them seriously. So yeah, those are the 2 reasons which caused the fall of Dahomey. Finally, last kingdom. Wow, this has been a long ride. Benin. Benin is the big boy. If you go to the British Museum, you can see the Benin bronzes that British stole from Benin when they invaded in like the 1800s. But this is covering earlier Benin, so keep that in mind, yeah. A lot of people watch YouTube videos going over later Benin, but this is earlier Benin. All right, let's keep going. Let's stay locked in, okay? So the rise of Benin, here are 3 reasons for the rise of Benin. Firstly, Ile-Ife. This was like a important area which was in Benin, which had a lot of spiritual links and cultural links. So for example, bronze casting was a key cultural facet of Ile-Ife, and it was taught within Benin as well. So that's one thing. The heads of the deceased Oba, so Oba were the people in charge of Benin, so they were like the main leaders. So the Alifin or the Aski or whatever, that sort of equivalent. The heads of the deceased Oba, when they had passed away, were sent to Ile-Ife because of the spiritual connection with the region. The third thing was, in response to that being sent, a copper cross cap was sent from Ile-Ife to Benin, or like the people in charge of Benin, which was meant to symbolize the Oni of life, to basically say, look, he's gone now, but he's going to live on, or whatever. So, yeah, Ile-Ife was quite important for the rise of Benin because it provided a spiritual foundation. They talk about it a lot in the ebook. I'm not really sure why, but there we go. Yeah, important. Number 2, leadership of Oba Uwere. He was like the main bloke. He did quite a lot of stuff. He established 3 associations of palace chiefs. Yeah, these were just 3 different groups which were helping to lead, I guess. There were royal festivals like Yuge Ira Uba, and that was for ancestors. So that was one of the things he introduced. And he also did a tax scheme. So he introduced taxes which he used to pay for roads which were built to allow like easier transport for trade. So he did quite a lot of stuff. The final point for the reason for the rise of Benin was geography. So the Niger River ran through Benin, which is quite good because obviously trade could flow through. The Atlantic Ocean was also nearby, so that meant trade with Europeans was viable, and there was easier trade with other areas of Africa as well. There was a lot of fertile soil in Benin, which meant that crops could be grown with more efficiency, I guess, and more crops could be grown. And there was also proximity to it's meant to say Ile-Ife, sorry about that. Proximity to Ile-Ife. And that was obviously advantageous because of the spiritual undertone it presented, or the backing it presented. I think the big thing about spirituality is that it connects people, I guess. It keeps people grounded and together. So having that link, that relationship basically maintains stability. That's why it's important and mentioned quite a lot. And finally, there's a lot of dense forest around Benin, which protected it from any sort of conflict. Cool, 3 points about the military. Firstly, Portugal, Isigi. This guy is a go, okay? I don't know what he did. He probably committed absolute travesties, but he was pretty amazing. He sent ambassadors to port for military support in 1514. So he sent ambassadors to try and get to Portugal to try and get military support for them in 1514. They were not really the happiest with Isigi because he refused to get baptized. And yet, despite this, the bloke was just a madness. He stole a cannon from the Portuguese, and that caused a bit of conflict. He stole a cannon, and they said, you're not allowed to have it because you're not baptized, but he didn't care. As well as that, Portugal, Edo. Edo is another... Edo is a region within Benin, which is quite important. And within Edo, there was beef, or there was conflict of some sort of kind. And what in particular happened was the Portuguese fought alongside the Oba in 1516. That's pretty much it. So Isigi basically said, yeah, Portugal, you better back it. And they did so. And they helped the Oba defeat whoever they were fighting in Edo, which is quite good. And then finally, the army. This is, I guess, the better piece of information to memorize. But there was 20,000 soldiers who were standing, so basically ready to fight. And there's 100,000 soldiers who are reserved, so ready at any time. I guess maybe take 5 minutes. The Oyo Asari was the guy who led the Benin Empire. So he was like the main guy in charge. Yeah, pretty much that. Nice. Economics. So there's 2 points. There's a lot of information now in the little passages beneath. There we go. So taxation and trade. So firstly, taxation. By 1702, it was noted that cowries provided good economic income for the people in charge of Benin, so the Obas. So yeah, that was pretty useful. The second point is that governors gathered locally. I don't really know why that's important, probably because they worked together to do like different tax schemes or whatever, public spending. And the final point is that the port was expanded. Well, yeah, cowries were basically taken. The Portuguese took cowries from the Maldives, and cowries were used as the currency within Benin. They took cowries and they just dumped them in Benin, which kind of like messed up the money supply, naturally, hyperinflation. But yeah, that was the third point. The economy was a bit of shambles. And the second point was trade. There's a lot of trade in Benin, naturally. In the 1500s, they leveraged slavery to monopolize yams, water, and wood. So they used slaves to sort of get these resources which they could then monopolize. In the 1600s, they... Sorry, I'm hearing noises. Scary. In the 1600s, they sold animals and woodwork. And then in the 1700s, they had a monopoly on cloth, but then they lost it, unfortunately. So there we go. Yeah. The next point, political. So 3 points here: public spending, political structure, and villages. So public spending, they taxed cowrie shells, which, as I mentioned earlier, they were used as the currency, cowrie shells. And they're using them to build roads using slaves, which is kind of good for them because they could then encourage more trade. And the roads were built wide enough to encourage armies and caravans to come. By encourage armies, I mean more so that they could take the large Benin army, which we already talked about, through the roads and stuff like that, so it's easier for them to transport. Then, as well as that, caravans were like for basically traders who were coming into Benin, so the roads were really wide, so traders could come with a lot of goods. Second point, political structure. There were 60 different types of 60 different officials within Benin. 20 were dedicated to working on tax, 20 were dedicated to working on trade, and 20 were dedicated to working on war. So those 60 people made up like the officials within Benin and working for the Oba. And then finally, villages. Villages were quite an important part of Benin. The Odinuere, the Onogi, and the Council of Elders sort of ran the villages. So they're like different people who had different roles. At times, they demanded labor, food, and chalk. And that's kind of like a ritualistic thing, as well as like sort of asserting dominance from the centralized aspect of Benin. Like, I'm the guy, the Oba, yeah, I'm the bloke in charge. I want stuff from you. You have to give it. And if you try and go against it, we will kill you. Like asserting authority to an extent. Religion, 2 things. Traditional religion and festival. So traditional religion was a big thing in Benin. Benin, I think, was the most resistant to European influence initially. So with regard to traditional religion, there were shrines which were implemented to show like spiritual strength within Benin. Casters were sort of seen as magicians. So there was a lot of belief in like spirituality and like traditional religion, kind of spooky stuff. But that was good because it meant that people connected, they had something grounding them. They were always afraid, I guess. And then as well as that, multiple deities. I think that might have been spelled incorrectly, but they believed in multiple deities. So there was a really strong sense of like traditional religious beliefs, which might inform us as to why they were so resistant to any sort of external influence from colonizers. There we go. The second thing was festivals. So there was a lot of festivals which took place in Benin, which were quite important for spirituality. Uge Ero Oba was dedicated to ancestors, and Agui was dedicated to the Oba's divine power. Yeah, cool. Let's keep going. Cultural. So casting was a big aspect of Benin's culture. So they used the lost wax method. There was a very intricate description in the ebook, but essentially the lost wax method was just one way of casting. So as you can see there, there's very nice bronze casting on the bloke and the lady. Yeah, it's very, very nicely done. There's a debate as to whether it was self-taught or taught in, I don't know what I said Oyo is, Ile Ife. Ile Ife, okay, is whether it's self-taught or Ile Ife, the people from there came over and taught it themselves. Irrespective, it doesn't matter too much. And yeah, the casters it was a very exclusive thing to be a caster. Like, it was kind of really high-ranking position because it is quite a difficult task, right? As you can tell. So yeah, that's just the point. And then cultural, as well as that, symbolism. There's a lot of symbolism in Benin. Obviously, Benin bronzes was a huge thing. Benin bronzes were like bronze statues and sculptures and stuff. And obviously, the British took them. And people were very upset at that. Helmet, cowries, swords, leaves. Yeah, all of these things were like, they had different meanings. So swords were designed as leaves. And that was to do with like the Oni of life, I think, or something like that, or like some sort of powering of strength. Helmets had cowries girded in them, which was sort of like, I'm richer than you. And Olokun was the deity of the sea. And I think when kids were born, they went to the sea, and the sea basically told them what sort of direction their life would go. And you also prayed to the sea to make sure your kid would be like born in an okay fashion. But yeah, the bronzes were, I think, the most significant aspect of culture within Benin. The most important thing to talk about. They were sort of used to consolidate power because they could, obviously, history is written by the victors. So bronzes can be made in a particular way to sort of enshrine certain people. So presumably the Obas. Cool, European influence. So Portugal arrived in the 1480s. It was the Sao Tome traders, so actually a similar time to Congo. But Benin was quite resistant to it. So although they tried to take them, like they reaped the advantages of having Portugal nearby, but they didn't really like want them to have too much influence. So 3 Catholic churches were created in Edo before 1500. But there was an embargo on slavery from the 1530s to the 1700s. So for about 170 years, they just resisted Portugal, which was quite amazing. Yeah, that's the first point. Second point, Isigi. This guy, he's very clever, as I mentioned earlier. He was a top bloke. He taught Portuguese. He was taught Portuguese by Zolo. Who was his dad. And then Isigi himself built a school to teach Portuguese. So he did, I guess, he wanted to educate his people, and it also made it seem like he wanted to develop good relations with Portugal, which was kind of Machiavellian in the sense that he could leverage that fact to say to the Portuguese, look, I'm actually trying my best. Please give us a lot of stuff. And then finally, in 1514, Isigi wanted help. They didn't give it. He ordered the seizure of a cannon. So he got his blokes to seize the cannon, despite him not being baptized, which is a bit controversial, but there we go. Fall of Benin, finally, two different reasons, European influence and succession crisis. So in 1575, which is quite early on, but the Itskiri broke away, which was like a group within Benin. They broke away, and that was sort of an indication that, and they broke away because of Portuguese influence. Was it because, yeah, because of Portuguese influence, sorry, because they came in the 1400s. And that was kind of problematic because it laid the foundations for other groups of people being very upset at the Portuguese. Because when the embargo was up in the 1700s, obviously it created a lot of problem. Another thing was, if these different groups, as I mentioned earlier, there were a lot of different groups. If these different groups were exposed to international trade, that was kind of problematic because it meant the power was decentralized. As long as you had a little bit of money, if you had access to international trade, you could buy a ton of scary stuff like guns or whatever. Which meant that there was now a reliance on selling to Europe because you wanted to get as much money as possible. You needed to rely on Europe to gain these resources, which allowed you to maintain a monopoly over control. So, yeah, European influence was sort of the downfall of Benin because when you start to rely on a country, on a region too much, they can sort of manipulate you. And I guess that's what happened. Second point, succession crisis. In 1608, Obo Juan died without an heir, which created problems naturally because a lot of people wanted the throne. And then in the 1700s, there was a civil conflict in Benin, and puppet obas sort of came up. So people who were actually controlled by other people. There was a lot of different conflict, but yeah, and slaves elsewhere. I guess that's problematic. There were slaves coming about in the 1700s. Finally, the embargo was up. Bit problematic, but there we go. Oh my gosh, we're done. Sorry. Okay, so just to summarize a few things, right? Just let me first summarize Benin. Benin is like the really... There's a lot of information, a lot of detail. Big thing was like cultural advancements, Benin bronzes, etc. I gave you a lot of information. Please fact check stuff where you can. Obviously, I memorized this stuff. I put them on Anki flashcards, so I did. I'll talk about that in a minute. But this is only like 20% of what's out there. There's so much information, but I've just tried to summarize the most important stuff. Yeah. Hopefully this has been useful so far, but that was a content, sort of summary, wherever I can. A lot of this stuff will be confusing. It's meant to be, it's designed as a revision. I'm not really teaching it to you. I'm just trying to remind you of a few key things to sort of trick your brain into remembering stuff. But yeah, that's sort of it. Instagram reel break. There we go. Get your scrolling done. Get your dopamine in. Woo! There we go. Let's keep going. The end of content. So it's a new beginning. How to revise. How to get A stars, okay? This basically goes for everything, but I'm going to, in particular, talk about how I use my revision methods for history. So my 3-step method, as per usual, is learn, memorize, practice. So sort of understanding, remembering, applying. That's sort of the thing that we're going for. So to learn African kingdoms, pay attention in class, use your teacher's notes. I think a lot of schools which study African kingdoms are very good schools. NCS, Harris Westminster, ICS. So given that information, they should provide good resources. So pay attention to your teachers, use those resources. Use this video, obviously. Hopefully this video is quite useful. Use the ebook, which is available. I'll touch on more resources later. The second thing, after sort of learning by reading and watching YouTube videos, is memorizing. And this is the most important thing. Anki. Anki is a digital flashcard app, which I talk about for ages. But I got 4 A stars in my A levels, and I got really high raw marks. And the reason why I did it was because of Anki, literally. Anki was the thing that made me do well. So, yeah, download Anki. It's completely free, no strings attached. Watch a YouTube video on how to use it. I have one, but it's a bit bad. It's a bit shit. So watch Ray M. Jard's video or something. Anki is a digital flashcard app. It uses really advanced algorithms and stuff. Basically, make flashcards, okay? Answer the question on the front, answer behind. So all the knowledge which I've just covered, try and put that onto flashcards. Like, I don't know, 3 factors for the economy of Dahomey, and then on the back have 3 factors. You can make your own, which I would highly suggest. But if time is ticking and you're about to be cooked, buy mine. Yeah, you can buy mine. They're available on my website. I would say it's always best to make your own. Just putting that out there. Even if that's going to lose me money, I don't care because it's the best thing. But if you are on free school meals, then just email me. I'm going to send them over for free. Don't care. Just email me. Give me evidence, ideally. So like maybe a letter saying I'm on free school meals, maybe from your school. But I will send over the flashcards happily. Cool. Third point, practice, exam analysis, right? Analysis is the key thing. A lot of people they do their mocks and they're like, oh, I got a B. Then they don't care. They don't look back at it. You need to analyze. You need to understand why you got the B. What separated you from the B and the A, etc. This is the most important thing, I think, aside from having the knowledge in there, being able to apply your knowledge, right? Even if you know everything, if you have bad exam technique, you'll get a B or a C, okay? So this is important. Look at exemplars, so questions or sort of answers which you know have done well, and copy them. Find patterns, okay? Find patterns in what they did correctly. Make a document with best practice. So make a document with like exam technique suggestions based on all the exemplars you read and what your teachers have said, etc. And get feedbacks from teachers too. So do a lot of practice questions, do a lot of practice essays, and then use those practice essays, give them into your teacher, say, please can I have a bit of feedback. Be very nice, of course. Teachers are very overworked and they can give you some nice feedback. So those are the 3 steps. I'll go into slightly more detail. The ebook is a useful resource. It's basically a PDF which covers everything. It's like the main revision guide, I guess. Completely free. Made by Toby Green. He's like the main guy who sort of created African Kingdoms, like the module within A-level history. So top bloke. Very nicely done. Cheers, mate. Cheers, Toby Green. My flashcards are available for 10 quid. I think they're pretty good. I mean, they got me an A-star. If you're on free school meals, please contact me. I'll give them to you for free. But most people, I think 10 quid isn't that big of a thing, hopefully. So yeah, 10 quid. Quiz of flashcards. These are completely free and available online. I can't discuss the strength of them or like how good they are. I mean, I've clicked on one of them. I remember going through them and thinking they were okay. So you can use them as well. I think my ones are better because obviously I worked so hard on them. I spent 2 years making them. So I can back them up because obviously they did get me 29 out of 30. Let's not forget. But yeah, the quiz ones, they seem decent. They're free. May as well use them. See what they're like. Yeah. Also, just be careful with like the information themselves. Just make sure to fact check because with African kingdoms, with the lack of like a centralized or strong centralized resource, it's difficult to fact check. So just be careful. OCR guide to assessments. So this is for exam technique. This is for like all of A-level history for OCR, but they have the fat document, which just tells you exactly what they're looking for. It's like best practice, what good answers look like, etc. Google it and use it. This helped me so much. OCR exemplars / examiners reports, pretty much what they say on the tin. So example answers which did really well, what the examiner said, sort of learn from them. I would give you my answers, but unfortunately I can't because it was in 2024 and they used them for mocks the next year. So if you email, if you're emailing me, so if you're doing A-level, in 2026, and I still haven't like uploaded them, email me and I will like put them onto this YouTube video, put them in the description or whatever, because then I'm able to do it. I can give my answers or whatever. My exam scripts, yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I can do so only after 2026, I think. Or like, I think I could probably do it after 2025 A-levels. So as soon as those A-levels are over, just let me know. As long as the information is available online, like the questions, then I can show you my scripts. And I have them for all 3 OCR history modules, so there we go. This video, yeah, hopefully this video is useful. I can't lie, the production value is probably not the highest. I'm not really a group of people, I'm just me in my bedroom. Well, today I'm in my kitchen, so there we go. But hopefully this video does come across as somewhat useful. Hopefully, fingers crossed. Exam technique. Okay, time to finish off this video by going through exam technique, okay? Once again, I'm not an examiner, okay? I'm not an examiner, but this stuff did help me get 29 out of 30. So I guess you can use pattern analysis to say it's probably correct. 10 marker, I spent 20 minutes on it. No introduction, okay? In the examiner's reports, they say we don't care about an introduction. So don't do it. For the main body, you want to do 2 main body paragraphs, okay? You want to do 3 pieces of evidence and analysis, which talk about the importance of the factor, because the questions are usually like, evaluate which is more important for something. So for example, evaluate which factor was more important for the rise of the Songhai Empire, the leadership of Songhai, or the geography. So I'd give 3 factors, 3 pieces of evidence which illustrate the importance of Songhai's leadership. So for example, he took over Timbuktu. This was important because X, Y, Z. And then I'd give 1 limitation of the factor. So for example, while Songhai wasn't actually that important because was it not for the fact that the Mali Empire had fallen down, then Songhai wouldn't have that much money and the wealth that he needed to start the empire. Interim judgments, this is really important, okay? And this is the thing that came up way back when at the start of the video when they criticized me a little bit. Interim judgments are basically where after you've explained the importance of a factor or after you've like made your point, link it back to your overall paragraph theme. So if your paragraph's about the leadership of Songhai, say, okay, here's my fact, here's my insight, as I mentioned earlier, so like English lit type. This therefore illustrates the importance of Songhai's leadership because, okay, that's what an interim judgment is. Basically just linking back to your thesis or like your main point. In the conclusion, you should not just summarize your point. This is the main thing. Like if you do any essay subject, you know you can't just summarize your point. You need to come to a supported, informed judgment, okay? What that means is you need to use evidence to support your thesis, and you need to basically evaluate, say, like, this factor is stronger than this factor because of this. I think a good way to do this is by talking about which caused the other, and also short-term, long-term analysis. So which caused the other? Leadership of, let's say your question was about the leadership of Songhai and the fall of the Malayan Empire. So which factor caused the other? Were it not for the fall of the Malayan Empire, then the Songhai Empire couldn't have risen, right? You needed the Mali Empire to fall. Therefore, you could argue that Mali was more important. The short-term, long-term, you could basically talk about like, oh, this factor was important in the short-term, however, this was far more important in the long-term. Therefore, the long-term one is more important. So that's how you do conclusion effectively. You don't just reiterate your point. You weigh up the strengths of each point and then come to a conclusion as to which one's more important, okay? That goes for the 10 and 20 marker. That goes for basically all of A levels. So yeah, that. Here's an example of a 10 marker, which was pretty good. So, was it pretty good? Yeah, I think so. I think I got like, I don't know, a good mark or whatever. On the one hand, religious reasons were the most significant for adopting Christianity. So, you can give a read of that. I guess you could screenshot it. But in terms of like what I did well, I talked about a piece of evidence. Congo holds traditional religious beliefs, elements of which partially aligned with that of Christianity. So that's like the idea of syncretism. Therefore, upon the arrival of the Portuguese, such alignments were emphasized with the notion of Catho-syncretism. In essence, the Congolese recognized these alignments and thus felt compelled to subscribe to Christian ideals. This was important given that power structures in Congo were lineage-based with the Kanda system. Matrilineal respect was integral to Congolese culture. As a result, behavior contradicting ancestors from within the lineage would be heavily shunned. Given the alignment of traditional religion and Christianity, the Congolese had the ability to uptake the new religion. If not, they've simply been able to, given the risk of totally disrupting the nation's power structure, therefore supported the argument that religious reasons were the most significant for the uptake of Christianity. Okay, basically, I talked about the idea of syncretism, so I gave the fact, and then I gave a lot of insight as to like why this is important. So it's integral to the power structure, it would completely disrupt culture, and then I gave a therefore supporting the argument. So this is my interim judgment. Therefore, supporting the argument that religious reasons were the most significant for the uptake of Christianity. Then I did that again, and then I gave a counter argument. However, it must also be noted that this switch was ultimately dictated, but then I beat up. As such is more convincing. Oh, hold on, no, I didn't beat this up. Yeah, sorry, last thing. This is so shambolic, I'm actually so all over the place. But basically, whatever your thesis statement is, you always have to relate back to it. So if you're saying the leadership of Songhai was the most important, even in your second paragraph, if you talk about something else, you need to end by saying, however, counter-argument, and that's why the leadership of Songhai was most important. So you just got to keep reiterating that same idea. You have to have like the same like point throughout the entire thing. So my hair's so fat. But anyways, so that's like the 10 marker. You can look over it yourself if you want. 20 marker. This time you need an introduction, but keep it short, sweet. Introduce your factors and then outline a thesis, okay? So by thesis, it means like your overall argument. So, I don't know, Timbuktu is the most important advancement, or like Timbuktu was the most successful element of the Songhai Empire. That comes up a lot. So, yeah, that would be your thesis, and then you introduce the factors. So you could say Timbuktu is maybe the most significant advancement, the economy, and then the military. So there's the 3 different themes, and then you work them out, sort of figure out which is the most important. 3 main body paragraphs, split them into themes, as I mentioned earlier, economic, political, social, whatever. 3 bits of evidence and analysis, interim judgments, consider both sides of the argument. Sorry, I just got some food. There you go, food was delivered. As I was, main body, 3 paragraphs, yeah, so 3 instead of 2 for the 20 marker. Spend 40 minutes of this, consider both sides of the argument, but whatever your main point is, you've got to constantly refer back to that, okay? Like you have to say, okay, therefore, this one's the most important. In the conclusion, once again, justify conclusion. Do you know what, 10 and 20 marker are quite similar. You just go into more depth for the 20 marker. That's about it. That's what I would say. Yeah, main body, 3. Here's the introduction. So the question is, to what extent was the role of Timbuktu the most important reason for the success of the Songhai Empire? I strongly agree. So flat out, there we go. I strongly agree that Timbuktu's role in the Songhai Empire was the most important reason for success. In this context, in this context, I'm basically, I'm giving like a definition or like a criteria. That's what they're looking for. So in the OCR examiner's report, they say like criteria is quite important. So basically I say, what is the criteria for like the most important reason, like the impact of the factor? So in this context, the impact of the factor in producing the empire's success can be measured through the extent to which it creates stability and prosperity. So that's my criteria. And then I give like the other factors. So while there are strong arguments to be made for the importance of Vasco Muhammad's leadership and Songhai's economy, it is important to note that Timbuktu laid the foundations for these successes by providing diplomatic backing to Aske's rule, preventing instability from other nations invading, and facilitating an Islamic trading network which encouraged globalization, resulting in economic prosperity. That was a long sentence. But basically, I laid out the other 2 factors, and I said why the Timbuktu's role in the Songhai Empire is the most important. So laying out 3 factors, essentially. So I made my first factor, mentioned the other 2, but then my one was the most important. So I just basically gave my overall point, and then later on I'm going to go into them. So on the one hand, this is 1 paragraph. I think this is from a separate essay, actually. Yeah, this one's from a separate essay. On the one hand, you could support the argument of Congo's steady decline. So once again, it's a similar thing. You just provide a piece of evidence. You could take a photo of that if you want. Provide a piece of evidence, provide the insight, link it back to your main question. There we go. Thank you for listening. Holy moly, this took way too long to record. Hopefully this was useful. I'm bound to have made mistakes, okay? I'm not a guru. I'm bound to have made mistakes somewhere. Just remember, I'm a kid. I just finished my A-levels. Yeah, I'm trying my best. If you need anything, please make a comment, email me, etc. I'm more than happy to respond. Hopefully this is helpful in some sort of capacity to anyone. I really hope it is. Hopefully this was useful. Best of luck with A-levels. Hopefully it goes well. And yeah, that was it. Bye.